Would you sell one night of your life if it could save everything you love? Sophie Bennett stared at the number on the screen. $50,000. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and desperation. The glow of her cracked phone lighting up her tired face as the message blinked again, waiting for her answer. And in that moment, the world around her felt painfully small. The peeling paint in her tiny apartment, the silence where laughter used to be, the unpaid bills stacked like quiet threats on the table, and the hospital voicemail she hadn't dared to listen to twice, reminding her that time was running out in a way money could measure, but she could not afford. And she closed her eyes just for a second, hoping when she opened them the message would be gone. But it wasn't. It stayed there like fate refusing to look away. Unknown client. One night. No questions. Payment up front. And Sophie's fingers trembled as memories rushed in. Losing her job at the pool after a guest complaint that wasn't even her fault. Her best friend walking out when things got hard. Her mom's voice weaker every day over the phone saying she was fine when they both knew she wasn't. And suddenly $50,000 didn't feel like a number anymore. It felt like oxygen, like one chance to stop everything from falling apart. And that terrified her even more, because nothing that easy ever came without a cost. And she knew it. She felt it deep in her chest, the quiet warning that this wasn't just a decision. It was a line she couldn't uncross. And still her thumb hovered over the screen, because what was the alternative? Watch everything slip away while she did nothing. Pretend dignity could pay hospital bills. Pretend hope was enough. And the silence in the room pressed in on her until it was too loud to ignore. And before she could overthink it, before she could stop herself, she typed one word, yes, and hit send. And just like that, everything changed. The reply came instantly, almost like he had been waiting. Instructions, a location, a time. Tonight? No. Delays. And Sophie's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might give her away. But there was no one there to hear it, no one to stop her, and hours later she stood outside a towering glass building that looked nothing like her world. The kind of place where people didn't worry about rent or overdue notices. The kind of place where decisions were made in seconds that could change lives like hers forever. And for a moment she hesitated, her reflection staring back at her in the polished doors. A girl who didn't belong here. A girl who still had time to walk away. But then her phone buzzed again. I'm waiting. And something in the words made her stomach tighten. Not aggressive, not demanding, just certain, like he already knew she would come. And Sophie swallowed hard, pushed the doors open, and stepped inside, unaware that the man she was about to meet wasn't just a stranger, and that this one decision was about to pull her into a world far more dangerous and far more complicated than she could ever imagine. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have. Each second stretching as Sophie watched the numbers climb higher and higher, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls, eyes wide, shoulders tense, as if she could still turn around if she moved fast enough. But the doors did not open until the very top, and when they did, everything changed again. The quiet was different here, heavier, controlled, like even the air followed rules she did not understand. And before she could take another step, a calm voice spoke from behind her, telling her she was right on time. And Sophie turned to see him for the first time. Alexander Cole standing just a few feet away, dressed simply but with a presence that made the entire room feel smaller, his gaze steady, unreadable, as if he had already figured her out before she even walked in. And for a moment, she forgot why she was there. Because nothing about him matched what she expected. There was no rush, no impatience, no awkwardness, just quiet control. And that unsettled her more than anything else, because she had prepared herself for something uncomfortable, something transactional. But this felt like something else entirely, and he gestured toward the living room with a subtle movement, inviting her to sit as if she were a guest instead of part of a deal. And Sophie hesitated before taking a seat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing through every warning she had ignored to get here. And then he did something she did not expect at all. He asked if she wanted water, his tone polite, almost distant, as if the situation carried none of the weight she felt pressing down on her chest. And she nodded slowly, unsure how to respond, watching as he poured a glass and handed it to her without letting his fingers touch hers. A small detail that somehow made everything more confusing. And when he finally spoke again, it was not about the agreement, not about expectations, but about her. asking how she was holding up, and Sophie almost laughed because the question felt so out of place it bordered on unreal. But she stopped herself, unsure if it was a test, unsure if anything here was what it seemed, and she answered carefully, saying she was fine even though her voice betrayed the truth. And he studied her for a moment, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt precise, intentional, like he was searching for something deeper than her words. And then he nodded once, as if confirming something only he understood, and that was when the silence returned, stretching between them, filled with questions Sophie did not know how to ask, until finally she broke it, her voice quieter than she expected as she asked why her, because nothing about this made sense, not the amount, not the calmness, not him. And for the first time a flicker of something crossed his expression, something almost like interest, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving hers as he answered in a way that only made things more complicated, saying that she was exactly where she needed to be, that some choices were not accidents. And Sophie felt a chill run through her, because it sounded less like an explanation and more like a warning. And before she could press further, before she could decide whether to trust him or walk away, he added one more thing, his voice steady, certain, telling her that tonight was not going to go the way she thought it would. And in that moment Sophie realized she had stepped into something far bigger than a simple agreement, something she did not understand yet, but was already too deep inside to escape. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something invisible had just shifted between them, and Sophie could not shake the feeling that she was the only one who did not understand what was happening, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass in her hands as she searched his face for any hint of clarity. But Alexander Cole remained composed, almost too composed, like a man who never needed to explain himself. And that made her heart race faster because uncertainty was far more unsettling than anything she had prepared for. And she finally forced herself to speak again, asking what he meant, her voice steadier this time, even though her thoughts were not. And he did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath them. And for a moment, Sophie wondered how many lives were moving down there, how many people had choices she no longer felt she had. And then he spoke again, saying that most people made decisions when they were desperate, but very few understood the consequences of being seen. And that word lingered in her mind, seen, because she had spent most of her life trying to go unnoticed, blending in, staying quiet, surviving without drawing attention. And now she felt exposed in a way she could not explain, like he had noticed something about her that no one else ever had. And she asked him directly what he wanted from her, because none of this felt like a simple agreement anymore. And this time he turned back to face her, his expression calm but focused, and he told her the truth in a way that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. He said he wanted her to stay, not just tonight, but longer, to step into a role that would change everything for her. And Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her, because this was not what she signed up for. This was not a single night. This was something ongoing, something bigger, and her first instinct was to say no, to stand up and walk out before she got pulled in any deeper. But then the number echoed again in her mind, $50,000, and she realized that was only the beginning, because people like him did not think in small amounts. And that realization scared her even more, because it meant the cost might be far greater than she could see right now. And she stood slowly, setting the glass down as she tried to steady herself, telling him she did not understand why her, because there had to be countless women who would say yes without hesitation, women who belonged in his world. And for the first time his answer came without pause. He said because she hesitated, because she questioned it, because she still looked like she might walk away. And that was exactly why he chose her. And Sophie felt her chest tighten because that answer did not feel reassuring. It felt like he had been watching her long before this moment, like this was not chance at all. And suddenly every instinct told her to leave, but her feet did not move, caught between fear and something else she could not yet name, something pulling her to stay just long enough to understand what she had stepped into. And as the city lights flickered behind him, Alexander took one step closer, not threatening, not forceful, just enough to close the distance slightly. And he told her quietly that she still had a choice, that she could walk out right now and never see him again, and he would not stop her. But if she stayed, everything would change, And Sophie realized in that exact moment that whatever decision she made next would define far more than just one night. It would decide the direction of her entire life. And the most terrifying part was not him, not the money, not even the unknown. It was the fact that a part of her was already considering saying yes. The word yes sat heavy in Sophie's chest, louder than her own heartbeat. And even though she had not spoken it yet, she could feel it forming, dangerous and irreversible. Because walking away should have been easy. It should have been the obvious choice. But nothing about this felt simple anymore. And as she stood there facing Alexander Cole, she realized the decision in front of her was no longer just about money. It was about stepping into a life she did not understand, one that could either save her or completely change who she was. And that thought alone made her hesitate longer than she should have, her mind racing through every possible outcome. Every warning she had ever heard about men like him, powerful, controlled, used to getting exactly what they wanted, and yet he was still standing there, giving her space, giving her a choice, and that made it harder to say no. Because if he had pressured her, if he had made it feel like a trap, she could have walked away without looking back, but this felt like something else, something calculated but strangely respectful, and that contradiction pulled her in deeper than she wanted to admit. And finally she spoke. Her voice quieter than before, but steady enough to carry the weight of what she was about to say, asking what exactly staying meant, because she needed to understand the rules before she crossed that line. And Alexander watched her carefully, as if measuring every word she said, before explaining that it was not about ownership or control, not in the way she feared, but about presence, about being by his side in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where trust was rare and often misplaced. And Sophie felt her confusion grow because it still did not fully explain why someone like him would choose someone like her to stand next to him in that kind of world. And she told him that directly, her honesty slipping through before she could filter it. And for a brief moment something softened in his expression, not enough to change him, but enough to make her wonder what he was not saying. And he told her that people in his world expected predictability, expected perfection, expected someone who played the role without question, and he was tired of that, tired of knowing exactly what everyone around him would do before they did it. And Sophie, with her hesitation, her questions, her uncertainty, was the opposite of everything he was used to, and that made her valuable in a way she did not fully understand yet. And the realization left her both uneasy and strangely seen, because no one had ever described her like that before. Not as someone valuable, not as someone different, and it made her wonder if this was really about him needing her, or about him wanting something he could not control. And that thought lingered as the room fell quiet again, the weight of the decision pressing down on her harder than before. And she looked around the penthouse, at the clean lines, the perfect view, the life that felt so far from her own it might as well belong to someone else. And she imagined what it would be like to step into that world even temporarily, to not worry about bills or survival, to breathe without the constant pressure of everything falling apart. And for a moment the possibility felt almost peaceful, almost tempting, and that scared her more than anything else. Because it meant she was already changing, already considering something she never thought she would. And slowly she looked back at him, her decision forming not from certainty, but from the quiet realization that she had already come too far to pretend this was just one night. And with a steady breath she told him she would stay, not fully understanding what she had just agreed to, only knowing that turning back now felt impossible. And as soon as the words left her lips, Alexander nodded once. Not surprised, not relieved, just certain, as if this outcome had always been part of the plan. And in that moment Sophie felt it, the shift she could not undo, the line she had crossed. And somewhere deep down she knew that whatever came next would not just change her situation, it would change her entirely. The moment Sophie said yes, everything around her seemed to settle into place in a way that felt almost too smooth, as if the decision had unlocked something that had been waiting long before she arrived. And Alexander did not celebrate or react the way she expected. He simply nodded once and moved forward as though this was the only possible outcome, which made her stomach tighten with a quiet realization that maybe she had not been choosing at all. Maybe she had been stepping into something already designed. And before she could question it further, he explained the next step with calm precision, telling her that things would move quickly from here, that her life outside this building would be handled, and that word alone made her pause. Handled, because it sounded both reassuring and unsettling at the same time, and she asked what that meant, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation she could not hide. And he told her that her apartment, her bills, her immediate concerns would no longer be her responsibility, that she would not need to return there for now. And Sophie felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort wash over her, because this was exactly what she needed, exactly what she had been desperate for. But hearing it said so simply made it feel less like help and more like a shift of control she did not fully understand, and she tried to ground herself by asking something practical, how long this arrangement would last, hoping for something definite, something she could hold on to. But his answer was vague in a way that felt intentional, telling her that it depended on how things unfolded, and that only made her more aware of how little she actually knew. And yet she stayed, because walking away now felt even more complicated than before, and within the hour everything began to change faster than she could process. A woman arrived, calm and professional, introducing herself briefly before guiding Sophie through what felt like a quiet transformation. New clothes, simple but elegant, chosen without asking her opinion, as if someone already understood what would fit her role, and Sophie followed along, still trying to keep up, still trying to convince herself that she had not made a mistake she could not undo. And when she caught her reflection again, she barely recognized the version of herself staring back, not because she looked completely different, but because something in her expression had shifted, something more composed, more guarded. And that realization stayed with her as she returned to the main room, where Alexander was waiting, his attention lifting to meet hers in a way that felt assessing but not critical. And for a brief moment there was silence again, the kind that seemed to carry meaning without words, until he finally spoke, telling her that there would be an event the following evening, something important, and that she would be attending with him. And Sophie felt her chest tighten because this was happening faster than she expected, stepping into his world before she even understood the rules, and she asked what she was supposed to do there, her voice careful, and his answer was simple but heavy with implication. Just stay close, observe, and trust that he would guide her if needed. And something about the way he said it made her realize that this was not just about appearances. There was something deeper at play, something she had not yet seen. And as the night settled around them, Sophie found herself standing in a life that no longer felt like her own, wondering how far this would go, and whether she would recognize herself by the time it was over, because deep down she could feel it. This was only the beginning, and whatever came next would test her in ways she had not even imagined yet. The next evening arrived faster than Sophie was ready for, and as she stood in front of the mirror in the quiet bedroom high above the city, she could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her at once, the unfamiliar dress that fit her perfectly without her ever choosing it, the soft lighting that made the room feel almost unreal, and the reflection staring back at her that still did not feel entirely like her own. Because this was not just about appearance anymore, it was about stepping into a role she did not fully understand. And as much as she tried to steady herself, there was a quiet tension in her chest that refused to settle, the kind that came from knowing she was about to walk into something she could not predict. And when the door opened behind her, she did not need to turn to know it was him. Alexander's presence carried a certain stillness that filled the space without effort. And when she finally looked at him, his gaze paused for just a second longer than usual, not with surprise, not with approval, but with something harder to define, something that made her feel seen in a way that was both grounding and unsettling at the same time. And he simply nodded, telling her it was time, and that was all. No long explanation, no reassurance, just certainty. And Sophie followed him out, her steps measured but her thoughts anything but calm. And the car waiting downstairs felt like another shift in reality, sleek, quiet, the kind of space where conversations carried weight even when spoken softly. And as they drove through the city, the lights passing by like a blur of something she used to belong to, Sophie found herself watching everything differently, noticing how far she had already come from the life she knew, and yet how uncertain everything still felt. And after a few minutes, she finally broke the silence, asking him what she should expect, her voice calm but edged with honesty. And Alexander glanced at her briefly before answering, telling her that the people she would meet tonight were not used to unpredictability, that they valued control, influence, and appearances above all else, and that her role was simple: stay composed, observe, and most importantly, do not try to be someone she was not. And that last part caught her off guard, because everything about this situation felt like she was supposed to become someone else, and yet he was telling her the opposite. And before she could question it, the car slowed, pulling up to a building that seemed to exist in a different world entirely. Elegant, guarded, the kind of place where every detail was intentional. And as they stepped inside, Sophie immediately felt it: the shift in atmosphere, the subtle attention, the quiet way people noticed Alexander without staring directly. And for the first time, she understood what he meant about his world. This was not just wealth. This was influence, the kind that moved silently but changed everything. And as they walked further in, she became aware of the way eyes lingered on her, not openly judgmental, but curious, calculating, as if trying to place her in a space where she did not quite fit yet. And instinctively, she moved a little closer to him, not out of fear, but out of awareness that she was out of her depth. And that was when she noticed it: the subtle shift in his posture, the way his presence seemed to sharpen slightly, not protective in an obvious way, but enough to signal that she was not alone in this. And for a moment it steadied her, just enough to take another step forward. But as the night unfolded, as conversations passed around her filled with words she only half understood, as names and glances carried meaning she could not yet decode, Sophie realized something that made her chest tighten. Quietly, this was not just an introduction. This was a test, and whether she realized it or not, she was already being watched, already being measured. And somewhere across the room, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face on a screen, a business broadcast playing silently. And when she looked closer, her breath caught, because the man standing beside her was there too. His name displayed clearly: Alexander Cole, Billionaire CEO. And in that moment, everything shifted again, because now it was real in a way she could not ignore. And as she slowly turned to look at him, she realized that whatever she thought she had agreed to, it was far bigger and far more dangerous to her sense of self than she had ever imagined. The moment Sophie saw his name on the screen, something inside her shifted in a way she could not undo, because until now, everything had felt controlled, confusing, but still contained. And now it expanded into something undeniable, something public, something powerful. Alexander Cole was not just a man with money. He was a man with influence, a man whose face appeared on screens, whose name carried weight in rooms like this. And suddenly Sophie understood why every glance tonight felt heavier than it should, why every quiet conversation seemed layered with meaning she could not yet grasp. And as she slowly turned her head to look at him, her thoughts collided all at once, questions she had ignored now demanding answers. And for the first time since she arrived, she felt something close to panic rise in her chest, because this was not just about stepping into a different life. This was about stepping into his world, and that world was far bigger than she had allowed herself to imagine. And she leaned slightly closer to him, her voice low but urgent, as she asked why he did not tell her, why he let her walk into this without knowing who he really was. And for a brief second, his expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes that felt more focused, more deliberate. And he answered quietly, telling her that if he had told her the truth from the beginning, she would not have come. And the honesty of that statement hit harder than anything else, because she knew it was true. She would have walked away. She would have never stepped into this situation if she had understood the scale of it. And that realization made her feel both frustrated and exposed, like she had been guided into a decision without seeing the full picture. And she told him that directly, her voice controlled but edged with something deeper. And he did not argue. He did not deny it. He simply acknowledged it in a way that made it clear he had considered this outcome long before it happened, and that only made her more aware of how calculated everything felt. And yet as she stood there, surrounded by people who belonged to this world, she also realized something else. She was already here, already part of it whether she liked it or not, and walking away now would not erase that. And as the night continued, she became more aware of the way people approached them, how their attention shifted subtly toward her, polite but curious, measured in a way that made her feel like she was being evaluated without a single direct question. And she responded carefully, remembering what Alexander had said, to stay composed, to observe, to be herself. And that last part felt almost impossible in a room where she did not know the rules, but she tried anyway, answering simply, listening more than speaking, and slowly she began to notice patterns. The way certain names carried more weight, the way conversations hinted at deals and alliances rather than casual interest, and it became clear that this night was not just social. It was strategic. Every interaction mattered, every impression lasted, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Sophie realized that Alexander had not just brought her here for appearance. He was watching how she handled it, how she adapted, how she held herself under pressure, and that realization made her straighten. Slightly, her awareness sharpening as she understood that she was being tested in a way no one had explained. And across the room, she caught his gaze for just a moment, and there was something there she had not seen before, not control, not distance, but something closer to approval, subtle but real, and it caught her off guard, because she had expected indifference, not recognition. And for a brief second it steadied her more than anything else that night. But just as quickly, the moment passed, and as another conversation pulled him away, Sophie found herself standing slightly apart, watching this world unfold around her. And for the first time, a new thought entered her mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. She was not just surviving this, she was starting to understand it, and that realization felt both empowering and dangerous at the same time, because the more she understood, the deeper she was being drawn in, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything, she could feel it building, the sense that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she had agreed to, and that whatever came next would not just test her place in his world, it would force her to decide whether she wanted to belong there at all. As the night stretched on, Sophie began to feel the subtle shift in how people looked at her, not just curiosity anymore, but recognition, like she had unknowingly crossed a line from outsider to something more defined, and that realization should have made her feel stronger, but instead it unsettled her in a way she could not ignore, because she did not know what they were recognizing her as. She did not know the role she was silently stepping into, and as she stood there holding a conversation she barely remembered starting, her thoughts drifted back to everything Alexander had said, about being seen, about not trying to be someone else, and she wondered if that was even possible anymore, because every moment here felt like it was shaping her into something new whether she wanted it or not. And when the conversation ended, she stepped away quietly, needing a moment to breathe, her steps carrying her toward the edge of the room where the noise softened just enough for her thoughts to catch up, and she looked out at the city through the tall windows, the lights stretching endlessly below, and for a brief second she felt small again, like the girl who had stood outside this world just hours ago, unsure if she even belonged near it. And that feeling grounded her, reminding her of who she was before all of this began. And just as she started to steady herself, a voice beside her broke the silence, calm but unfamiliar, asking if this was her first time here. And Sophie turned to see a woman standing nearby, elegant, composed, the kind of presence that did not need attention to command it. And Sophie answered honestly, saying yes. And the woman smiled slightly, not unkind, but knowing in a way that made Sophie instantly aware that she was being understood more than she intended. And the woman commented that it showed, not as criticism, but as observation. And then added something that made Sophie pause, saying that people like Alexander did not bring someone new into this space without a reason. And Sophie felt her chest tighten slightly, because that was the question she had been trying not to ask, and before she could respond, the woman continued, explaining that in this world, nothing was random. Every presence meant something. Every introduction carried weight, and Sophie realized that whatever she thought her role was, it was being interpreted by others in ways she did not control, and that realization made her more aware than ever of how exposed she was. And she asked quietly what people thought she was, and the woman held her gaze for a moment before answering in a way that felt both simple and heavy, saying that people were trying to figure out whether she was temporary or something more permanent, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. And Sophie felt the words settle in her mind, temporary or permanent, because she had not even decided that for herself yet, and hearing it spoken out loud made it feel real in a way she could not avoid. And before she could ask anything further, the woman gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving Sophie alone with thoughts that now felt impossible to ignore. And as she stood there processing everything, She became aware of Alexander approaching again, his presence cutting through the noise effortlessly, and when he reached her, he did not ask what was wrong. He simply looked at her in that same steady way, as if he already knew something had shifted, and Sophie met his gaze with a new clarity, one that had not been there before, because now she understood that this was not just about him choosing her. This was about how she would choose to exist in his world, and for the first time, the question was not just whether she would stay, but what staying would actually mean. And as the night began to wind down, Sophie realized something that both grounded and unsettled her at the same time. She was no longer just reacting to what was happening. She was starting to see the structure beneath it, and that meant her next choices would not come from confusion, but from awareness, and that made them far more dangerous than before. The drive back felt quieter than before, but not in the same uncertain way. This time the silence carried weight, like something had been revealed that could not be undone, and Sophie sat beside Alexander watching the city lights blur past the window, no longer feeling like an outsider looking in, but not quite belonging either, suspended somewhere in between, and that space felt more complicated than anything she had experienced before, because now she understood enough to know that this was not temporary unless she chose it to be, and that realization settled heavily in her chest as she finally spoke, her voice calm but more certain than it had been all night, asking him what he expected her to become in all of this. And for a moment he did not answer, his gaze fixed ahead as if considering not just her question but everything behind it. And when he finally responded, his voice was steady, almost quieter than before, telling her that he did not expect her to become anything, that the only thing he required was honesty, not perfection, not performance, just honesty. And that answer caught her off guard again, because it did not match the world she had just stepped into, a world built on appearances and calculated interactions, and she told him that directly, pointing out that nothing about tonight had been simple or honest, and for the first time there was a slight shift in him, not defensive, but reflective, as if he acknowledged the contradiction without needing to explain it away, and he admitted that his world operated on layers, that most people never showed their real intentions, and that was exactly why honesty was rare and valuable. And Sophie felt something click into place as he spoke, because for the first time his reasoning felt less like control and more like a quiet truth, something he believed rather than something he was using, and she realized that beneath everything, beneath the wealth and the influence and the careful structure of his world, there was something else guiding him, something she had not fully seen until now, and that made her look at him differently, not as a man who had pulled her into this situation, but as someone who had been navigating it long before she arrived. And as the car slowed to a stop outside the building, Sophie felt the weight of the night settle into something clearer, not simpler, but more defined, and when they stepped inside, the familiar quiet of the penthouse felt different now, less intimidating, more like a space she had already begun to understand. And as they moved through it, she stopped for a moment, turning to face him fully, knowing that this was the point where everything shifted again. And she told him honestly that she did not know if she belonged in his world, that she did not know if she could become what people expected her to be. But she also admitted something she had not been willing to say before, that she did not want to walk away without understanding it first, and that was the truth she could not ignore anymore. And Alexander watched her closely, not interrupting, not correcting, just listening in a way that made her feel like her words mattered more than the decision itself. And after a moment he nodded slightly, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, and told her that she did not need to decide everything now, that staying did not mean losing herself unless she allowed it, and that leaving would always remain an option if she chose it. And Sophie held on to that, because it was the first time since this began that she felt like she still had control over something, even if it was just the choice to continue or not. And as the night came to a quiet close, she realized that this was no longer about survival or desperation. It was about something far more complex, something that would require her to define who she wanted to be in a world that could easily shape her into something else. And as she stood there in the stillness, one thought settled clearly in her mind. She had stepped into his world for a reason she thought was simple, but now the real question was no longer why he chose her. It was whether she would choose to stay when she finally understood everything, and that answer was still waiting ahead.